Hello everyone, thank you. Thanks for having me and letting me, giving me this opportunity to speak to you about this. This is a subject that I'm very passionate about, but it's also, I suppose, a very integral element to our culture and a lot of what we do here at the Ralph. I won't talk too much about sort of me and my backgrounds. If you're kind of wondering what links someone who used to go backwards in boats and fly planes to what we're doing here at the Ralph, I suppose in a nutshell, really the thing I'm passionate about is what it is that helps people and teams to sort of deliver the skills they've got reliably. And aviation had a unique opportunity to understand that through black box recorders, and the role that I had in the airlines I worked for was delivering this human factors training, which is based around communication, teamwork, and all sorts of other things. Really, the last 7 years of what I've been doing is about how we can apply the concepts, mostly from the work I did in aviation, but also from sport and sports coaching and other areas, to life in veterinary practice, and very much how that applies here at the Ralph. And just to give you a snippet into a very tangible example of one of the things that we do in this regard, Ralph Safe, by the way, is sort of the name we've given for our patient safety program here at the Ralph, hence that little extra logo down at the bottom. And within that, Civility Saves Lives is one of the, as I said, very specific and important elements of one of the things we've done. Just quickly before I go into it, has anyone ever heard of this before? Civility Saves Lives, the concept of, there's a little nod there, so I won't single anyone out, I always like to see the reaction. So always maybe a few people. For those of you that haven't, Civility Saves Lives is an initiative that was started originally from the human side of healthcare. Civility, I suppose the opposite of civility being incivility, and really it's an initiative and an area that looks at the very tangible and powerful link between the way people treat each other and the impact that has on patient outcomes. So within healthcare, the original initiative that was started, Civility Saves Lives, was started by a group of volunteers from within the NHS, and there a few people who recognised three main things. So the first thing they recognised was that there's a growing body of evidence that shows a very powerful link between the way people treat each other, or are perceived to treat each other, and the impact that has on patient outcomes. The second thing they recognised is that, as very experienced healthcare professionals, they recognised that there had been multiple times throughout their career where things that they had perceived to have been, or the way that they perceived to have been treated, had impacted their ability to look after patients. The other thing they recognised is that multiple times throughout their career, things they had done to other people had been perceived in ways that had impacted their ability to look after patients. And I think they recognised that no one was talking about this. I mean, people were talking about it. Everyone knew it was a real thing, but no one was really talking about it. No one was really doing anything with this body of evidence. So that's where Civility Saves Lives came from. And we got the opportunity to work with one of the people that founded that original movement. Someone called Chris Turner was very generous, not only with sort of letting us use this, the name, insisting that we do in fact use the name Civility Saves Lives, but also working very closely with us to develop our version of that and what we run here at the Ralph. So this is more of a sort of general insight into something we do rather than something specific to Ralph's journey, but hopefully gives you an idea of something that, as I said, is very important to us. So that's the very kind of broad overview of what we're talking about here. So incivility, let's talk about that a bit more. What are we actually talking about? Well, yes, some people talk about the concept of incivility as being synonymous with rudeness. It's not entirely correct, and there's an awful lot of complexity around this word. One of the things that's really worth mentioning is that when Chris Turner and the group, the volunteers that started Civility Saves Lives, when they originally started what they did, they weren't trying to suggest that we need to go and find the hospitals who have got a problem with incivility. And within that, we then need to go and find the people who are being rude. And we need to go and find them, we need to sort them out, we need to deal with them. What they were doing was they were recognising that whenever you get a group of people together, particularly a large group of people in demanding, often pressured situations where things can sometimes be difficult, such as a hospital, such as a veterinary referral centre, there are going to be moments where sometimes the way that people's behaviour is received is not the way it was intended. And it's kind of a powerful acknowledgement. But rather than just saying, well, that's the way it is, that's where it's always been, there's nothing we can do about it, it's about acknowledging that, but then also saying, and what can we do? What can we do to use this information? Because the reality is there's going to be subjectivity. It's not as easy as to just say, we're going to define the uncivil behaviour and we're going to outrule it. We're going to sort of develop rules and laws and prevent it from happening. Because one of the first things we've got to do is acknowledge this incredible level of subjectivity within this subject. So just to give you an example of what I mean by that, who here, for example, perceives themselves to have ever been in a situation where you perceive someone to be uncivil towards you in a working environment? Some nods. Can anyone here confidently put their hand up and say, no, I've never been in a situation where I perceive someone to have been uncivil towards me in a working environment? This is a reality of work. As I said, it's not about saying, therefore, that there's nothing we can do, but it's complex. Because the thing we also know is that we can't just go around labeling and judging. Person A, it's easier to do it this way, could behave in a way towards person B. Person B might be really upset. They might feel embarrassed, they might feel undermined, they might feel belittled, they might feel disrespected. Person A could go and behave in exactly the same way towards person C. Person C might be absolutely fine, genuinely fine, not bothered, not affected. What does that mean? Does that mean that person C is somehow not sensitive enough, needs to care more? Does it mean that person B is too sensitive and should care less? Does it mean that person A is categorically a rude person because person B is upset? Or that the behaviour that they demonstrated was categorically rude? We could discuss all those things all day, but to an extent, actually, they don't really matter. The point is, if person B feels upset or belittled or undermined or whatever they feel, that's the one thing we can never argue with. We can never tell someone what they feel or don't feel. So the opportunity within Civility Saves Lives is to recognise those opportunities, is to recognise those moments, those opportunities to heal those events that occur. So what it does tell us is that when that occurs, person A and person B have an opportunity to have a better relationship, to understand each other better. And that's what all the science and all the work that's gone on has shown us. What we're trying not to do necessarily is always identify and go, this is rude, this isn't rude, and if this happens, then this is what's going to happen next. Because all that does is it fuels this idea of perpetrator and victim. And actually that can be quite unhelpful. Now there are exceptions to this, but a lot of it is incredibly subjective. So that's one of the starting points. Another one of the underlying principles around Civility Saves Lives is this, in the pool of information. Essentially, this represents a team of 5 people. Of course, you may work in moments within a team of 2. You may work within a team of more than 5. But let's say in this team there's 5 people, and let's say the person at the top there is the decision maker in that team. Would it be fair to say normally most teams need a decision maker? We don't normally have a situation where a patient deteriorates and we need to sort of put our hands up and have a vote as to what we do next. So we normally need a decision maker in a team. Let's say on this occasion it's the person at the top. There's loads of work, and there's a very powerful study they looked at with simulations of neonatal resuscitations that demonstrates that when you have a team such as this, the more that people share information, the better the quality of those decisions that are being made by that decision maker. And the better quality of decisions are linked with better outcomes for patients. And they repeated these studies many, many times. When people are turning on their taps and sharing and contributing towards that pool of information, the outcomes are better. It almost sounds too simple, doesn't it? But that's what, not surprisingly, was found. And so up to 60% of the quality of the outcomes was being correlated to how much information was being shared in these simulations of these resuscitations. And the thing that affected how much information was being shared the most was the perception of incivility. When someone was perceived to be uncivil, the recipient, let's say it was this person, turned off their tap. They just stopped sharing. And to an extent, interestingly, so did everybody else. And they just starved the decision maker of that information they need to make the best decisions they can. And an awful lot of what's talked about within this subject comes down to this concept of psychological safety. Has anybody here ever heard explicitly of that expression before? Yeah, one, few, anyone else, a few nods. It's not necessarily a mainstream area of sort of research or literature certainly within the veterinary profession, but it is becoming more widely discussed. Psychological safety is a concept that relates to our need to feel safe. Other than meeting our physiological needs, it's the second most significant human needs, many would argue. 20,000 years ago, our feeling of need to be safe was from predators, was physical safety. Now, not that many of our patients represent this predator on the screen here, so that isn't something that is a factor for us in most of our sort of working lives on a day-to-day basis. But the need is still there. That need is met through feeling safe within our team. The part of our brain that detects threats such as this prepares us to either run away or fight or hide, responses that have not generally been found to be very effective to high-performing teams within a veterinary practice. That part of our brain that prepares us to respond in that way just simply doesn't know the difference between a real threat and a perceived threat, feeling not as they were not respected, not feeling heard, not feeling appreciated, all sorts of things that can come as a result of a perception of incivility, perception being the word. Why the picture of Google? Google have done a huge study a number of years ago to understand the thing that differentiates higher from lower performing teams. And the thing they found that differentiated them the most, above all else, above all the technical skills, above all the technical factors, was that of psychological safety. Teams who felt safe perform better. And that's hugely important because of the link to this subject we're talking about around civility. So psychological safety is a culture of respect, trust, and openness where people feel safe to raise concerns and share ideas. It's that pool of information, and it's fundamental not only to high-performing teams, but fundamental to a culture that we want to support at the Ralph. So having the ability to talk about that, having a mechanism to talk about that, but not only to talk about it, but in terms of what we can then do about it is incredibly important. So defining incivility is surprisingly difficult. The conclusion from most of the work that's gone on within Civility Saves Lives, the original movement I mentioned, was this. Rudeness or incivility is defined by the interpretation of the recipient, regardless of intent. I don't know, how does that land with you when you read that? Incivility or rudeness is defined by the interpretation of the recipient, regardless of intent. Does that sound logical? Because in some ways, it's kind of hard to disagree with, but it also challenges our sense of wanting to be right. If we're the recipient of something we feel like we've been wronged, in some ways we don't want it to be that way. We want to feel as though, no, that behaviour was wrong, and I want the world to know it was wrong, and I want, we all have that within us. But actually, if we look at it in a moment, or if we look at it from a sort of external perspective, or we sort of reflect on these things when maybe we're not feeling emotional, having just been the recipient of those moments, we recognise that actually the vast majority of people do intend to treat other people well. Most people go to work with the intent to be nice to each other. And the vast majority, and in fact there is evidence for this as well, the vast majority of these events are because of misunderstandings, because something wasn't received in the way it was intended. Not always, but the vast majority of the time. But the one thing we can never disagree with is how something was perceived. So in some ways this is quite a controversial thing to say, but it's absolutely inherent to the whole concept of Civility Saves Lives. So why are we talking about this? Why is this so important? Well, there's a whole load of work that's been done in various professions, healthcare being one of them, not as much yet, well, nothing explicit really within veterinary yet. I say yet because I think it's inevitable. But what information do we have? This is work from Christine Porath and Christine Pearson. It was published about 10 years ago. Some work that took place over multiple professional fields. Healthcare, as I said, being one of them, hence the reference to patients. And this isn't about trying to sort of be overly dramatic or scary about it. It's just acknowledging it. And I don't know if anyone's sort of seeing these things, feeling surprised or anything particularly resonates. It's always interesting just to reflect on that and think to yourself, actually, are there any of those that particularly jump out at me? 61% reduction in cognitive ability. That's because if we feel threatened in some way, our brain's preparing us to run away or fight or hide. The blood is flowing to the wrong part of our brain. It's not flowing to the part of your brain you need to make decisions, to function in the way you need to function within a practice. 25% take it out on patients. The reason there's an asterisk is because it's not necessarily intentional, but on reflection, it's the impact it had on patients. Offender is in inverted commas because I don't like that expression. It's not as simple as that. It's just there for brevity, hence the inverted commas. But it's just interesting to reflect on. These are the things that can happen when this becomes something that is repeated within teams, and why it therefore matters so much. So what about veterinary healthcare? What do we know? So a lot of this I've mentioned so far is from outside the profession. There's some work that took place back in 2017 from vetsurgeon.org, vetnurse.co.uk, to look at behaviours in practice. They got 677 responses. Don't worry if you can't see the specifics on the table. They got 677 responses to really understand some of the implications of these kind of things. Things like 73% of those 677 respondents said that they'd been belittled in front of people. 65% had felt they'd been criticised minutely. 54% of practice managers had been shouted or screamed at. And loads of other things, but just some of the most sort of standout ones. 48% of nurses felt at times deliberately excluded or ignored. Again, it's just to acknowledge, really, and this may or may not represent your experience, but it's to acknowledge this is why this matters. These are the things that we know are happening. Some of them are inevitable to some extent, but it doesn't mean that we should just say, okay, well, that's it then. It means that we have more of a reason to move towards it and say, well, what can we do to make this the very best place we can, despite the fact that these things will happen in groups of people. There's another piece of work that took place a couple of years ago, working together with the University of Aberdeen to start looking more specifically at incivility in veterinary practice. This was a more detailed review, but this is just to start to look at the impacts. So we know that incivility, from all regards, is significantly linked to job satisfaction. It's linked to turnover and retention, and it's linked to burnout. Now, it might sound obvious to say that, but when you ask questions independently, you're not asking people to say, do you think these things are linked? You're looking at a big survey with dozens of questions. And when you ask these questions independently, the correlations between these areas and incivility are extremely strong. Not surprising, but important to know. I always like to show this one here. What do we look like on a bad day? Because one of the things we've done here at the Ralph is we've introduced these concepts. We had sort of multiple workshops to introduce the underlying sort of factors, the evidence, the concepts. And then we did another one sort of a month later to introduce what we can do about it that I'll talk about in a minute. And this was to everybody. And since then, we've done things to sort of keep that going with anyone that's joined more recently. And one of the things that we talked about right at the beginning was this. And what I was trying to do is acknowledge that within all this, there is an opportunity. There is an opportunity to have a trigger that makes us more aware and more conscious of our behaviour. But it's just part of the whole thing. Because what we can't do is just simply say, hey, everybody, all this evidence for why behaviour matters and civility saves lives. So, hey, be nice to each other, okay? I mean, it would be nice if it was that simple. But as I said, it's the reality of the human condition is that it isn't that simple. However, within all of this, one of the opportunities is to increase conscious awareness of the way that our behaviour might be received. It's not the only part. So it's an important part of the discussion to recognise possibly moments where we're not at our best, to be more aware of that, but whilst also acknowledging that we cannot just eliminate the moments where possibly things are not going to be received in the way they're intended. So it's part of the discussion. It's just giving you insights into the sort of things that we've discussed. Another big part of this brings us on to this concept of culture. So my role at the Ralph is about really understanding elements of our culture, our core values, our ethos, our journey, and looking at very specific ways that we can positively influence the direction of that in a way which is aligned with our values. And I think something like this, it's easy to feel like, well, yeah, but what can we do? In professions where there are sort of clear hierarchies and where there's often situations where people are under pressure, and it can be difficult because outcomes for patients aren't always as hoped, and all these factors that can affect how people feel within a team. It's easy to just say, yeah, so it's always been that way. There's always been an element of this kind of behaviour that possibly some people might feel that people like that are always going to treat people like that in certain ways, whatever it might be. And we know from history that there have been loads of situations. Aviation's one of them. It used to just be assumed that captains would always behave a certain way towards the rest of the crew because they're the ones that are in charge, and you just kind of have to accept that. You have to wait your turn till you can be the person that gets to behave like that. Not because anyone who worked in that profession, going back 40 years was trying to cause a problem. That's just the way it was. And anyone that suggested it could be any other way was seen as just sort of fighting a lost cause. But it did change. It's changed an awful lot. So I think one of the things is that, yes, it's to acknowledge that these things aren't easy. These things take time. These things take work. But we do know that if we don't discuss things that are sometimes uncomfortable, if we don't acknowledge things that are sometimes not easy, then we're not giving ourselves that chance. And there's this kind of element of a crossroads where we can make that choice. And we are doing what is within our control. Not everything is, but we're doing what is within our control to guide us in a direction which is consistent with our values. Talking of which, our culture, without going into a sort of discussion on kind of what we mean by the term culture and other things that we're doing, this is just, I suppose, an example. There are thousands of examples of things that we can do very deliberately, very consciously, to direct our journey in ways that are consistent with our core values. We have 7, these are 3. We value our people and prioritize their well-being. That isn't a box you can tick by doing any one thing. But this is one thing we can do, we know that can affect it. Because one thing, not the only thing, but one thing that can significantly affect people's well-being is the treatment or the perception of treatment from people in a team. We know that, there's evidence for that. And we can anecdotally find that out from within the team as well. Acting with compassion. Compassion, one of the things we measure from one of the annual surveys we do, followed by sort of subsequent discussions with teams, is to understand the perceptions around compassionate treatment. Whether or not people feel they're being treated with respect, whether or not they ever feel intimidated within a team. there's no single solution to that, but this is one way we can support that. In the same way that we can talk explicitly about gratitude, and we can help to build and make that a conscious process. So these are all intricately linked. There's no one thing you can do that solves any of these things, but there are lots of things we can do that help contribute towards them. Because culture in organizations where behaviors are consistent or largely consistent with values is very rarely an accident. And we're just doing everything we can that's within our control to make that real. So, kind of coming on to this main concept. Let's come back to the concept of civility. What do you think about this? Do you imagine many people wake up in the morning, get out of bed, right? I'm going to inflict misery today. And I guess, like, jokes aside, it's sometimes hard to, if we have ever been in a situation we've perceived someone, or especially if it's happened multiple times, to treat us in a certain way, it's sometimes hard to imagine that that's not the case. The truth is, there's evidence that the vast majority of people do intend to treat other people well. There are very, very few people in the world that actually set out to cause misery. And that therefore the vast majority of these events are in fact misunderstandings. But that doesn't mean that we should just kind of go, oh well, there we go then. Because we also must not forget the flip side. That if these events do continue, even though they're probably not intended, that this is the sort of things that can happen. So there's a risk here that if we start talking too much about this, that we forget this. And we mustn't forget this. It's too important for our patients. It's too important for the people within teams. So we must acknowledge that if we're in a situation, and this is one of the things we talk about within this whole initiative, this program we've got, is we don't want people to we want people to be curious. We want people to go away and maybe think, well, I wonder why that person behaved towards me in that way. Maybe they weren't having a good day. Yes, we want that curiosity, but we don't want that to mean that they go home genuinely upset or hurting, fearful that it might happen again, and just sort of rationalizing it because, well, maybe they didn't mean it and therefore I won't do anything, because it's too important. So what we want to try and do is move away from this idea that therefore the only solution is to go and blame them, is to go and threaten them, is to go and report them, but to create another way of addressing that. And there's evidence for that, and that's what's great. We're not making this up. We can use evidence to support that concept. This is an infographic that I have sort of graffitied on slightly. So this comes from the original Civility Saves Lives movement. They've got some great infographics on their website. I just changed the word Ralpha in there. And there's some slightly dodgy colour matching. But the concept is very much the same, whether we're talking about a member of Team Ralph or a member of any team. The vast majority of people intend to treat each other well. This represents that evidence. There's stuff that happens, stuff at home, stuff that's not at home. Stuff is always going to happen. We can't control that. Whilst we can also address the extent of this in other ways, we can't ignore the fact that to an extent it's always going to be there. There are days where not everyone's their best self. We can't just stop that from being the case. What we can do something about is this. Whether or not we're in an environment where the message is, yeah, but there's nothing you can really do. If you're really upset, go and report it. Been a grievance. Is there another way? Is there another way that we can have a sense that actually we will have a sort of an expectation, an understanding that if someone does something that's not perceived, not appreciated, that there's a way of helping communicate that in a compassionate, constructive way, so that it's not just something that becomes habitual, and without realizing it, these behaviors just become part of the norm. Is there another way? And that's what the infographic means. I'm not going to get too lost in this because we haven't got time, and inevitably it's something that I'm really interested in, but maybe you're looking at it going, I really don't need to know all about that pyramid. But I'll give you the very brief version. The Vanderbilt University Medical Center in the United States did a lot of work on looking at civility behavior within healthcare teams. In fact, they're so interested, they looked at 37,000 different events involving perception of incivility in healthcare teams. And they did a whole load of work. What they basically said was routine feedback. That basically says that the vast majority of behaviors is fine. Most people, most of the time, don't even realize it. They're just going, thanks very much, no problem, yeah. Oh, actually, next time, would you mind if? All these sort of little interactions. But what happens is sometimes people are not happy. Now, this is my opportunity to point out what I mean by these two words, egregious or mandated. Some of the examples of these events where people perceive incivility to have occurred are not subjective. Remember at the beginning, person A, person B, person C, subjective. That's not always the case. if someone... Now, the mandated is something with a legal framework, so I'll start with that. If someone does something that has a legal framework, so if someone is harassing someone on grounds of prejudice based upon race or gender or beliefs, that's not subjective. That doesn't come under this is that sort of goes out with this framework, or at least it gets escalated. Egregious is something that doesn't necessarily have a legal framework, but is really standout. Someone shouts and screams, and someone says, "Please stop this now," and then they go out of the room, and someone chases them to the next room and keeps shouting and screaming. Those kind of events, they're not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is single concern, stuff that happens. Someone interrupts someone else, someone rolls their eyes at them, someone, sort of withholds information, even though they really should share it with someone. Stuff that just day-to-day events. They're what we call mild to moderate incivility. They're important, but they're not one of those other two things I mentioned. When these events occur, what we want to try and do is have a means of helping people to understand each other. And we also need to know there's a framework so they don't keep going on forever. And that's the reason I show you that there is a pyramid. And we have very much aligned the concepts from this work at Vanderbilt University with our H&R team so that our policies around this are aligned with this. But it's all based around this. What do we do when these events occur? And the guidance around that, these single concerns, is what they call calling out with compassion. So it's providing a guidance for how we can have these discussions in a constructive way. So calling out with compassion is what they found, what they wanted to try and do is understand what can you do that means that when these events occur, we have an alternative to what normally happens. I don't know what your experience of this is, but this is what the research would suggest. What normally happens is that someone's on the receiving end of these mild to moderate events of incivility once, twice, maybe multiple times, and they either do nothing because, well, maybe they weren't having a good day, but maybe they were, but who knows, it's not going to change. I don't know what I would do. I don't feel safe doing it. For all these different reasons, nothing happens, and therefore nothing changes. Or they get really unhappy and they report it in a very formal way to a line manager, to a member of an H&R team, and that can be appropriate. But when it's these very subjective events that are at this stage where they're currently quite informal, the evidence would suggest that those are unlikely to be the best channels. And actually, the best thing we can try and do is have a system where people provide informal feedback to each other. And that's where calling it out with compassion comes from. So calling it out with compassion has two purposes and three parts. Two purposes are to care about the person we're talking to. And that's hard. If you perceive someone to have been uncivil to you, it's quite hard to be like, I'm actually going to start by thinking, I wonder how they are. The second thing is to land the information. And the information that they found is the most important is how the recipient feels, not what the person did. And that's really hard also, because the part of our brain wants to win and tell them how wrong they were, and everyone to know how wrong they were. And there's three parts to these conversations, what they call a check-in, an inquiry, and delivering the message. So I'll just give you an example of this. This is just something we've talked about quite a lot in different teams. So let's say, for example, I perceive someone to be uncivil. This is the ideal version, I guess. Not at the time, but maybe later that day or the next day or within a few days, I would just try and contact them, and I would arrange ideally to meet them in an area that wasn't, surrounded by other people. And I would do three things. The first thing, I would just check in. I'd start the conversation in whatever way is natural. How are you? How's your day going? How's your week going? Oh, I know it's been a busy week with so and so being away. How's that? Whatever. It depends on what I know about the person. But whatever is right for me to genuinely show that I want to know how you are. Now that person might just suddenly launch off into a 5 or 10 minute, review of their week, and that's a good chance actually to just listen. We'd have to solve their problems. And that's kind of a weird thing to do almost if you think, well, I'm approaching them because I feel they've been rude to me. But that's our chance to connect with them. At some point, what we want to do is inquire. At some point, what I would say is something like, can I ask, do you remember when I came and spoke to you on Tuesday morning about X, Y, and Z? I'm not retelling the story. I'm not telling them what they did or didn't do. I'm just saying, do you remember this moment in time? And then they can do two things usually. Either they can just say, yes, I remember why. They're unlikely not to remember if you're specific enough. Or they can say, actually, yeah, as you're saying that, I'm replaying it in my mind. I'm so glad you said. I was really distracted, and I think I completely ignored you and then walked away. And now you say, I'm really sorry about that. And it might be that I say, actually, yeah, that's exactly how I felt, and thanks for saying. And then we might have a chance to talk about it. If they don't, and they just say, yeah, I remember that, why? My opportunity now is to deliver the message. And what I'm delivering is how I felt. So I would say something like, after we spoke, I felt undermined, embarrassed, disrespected, whatever it is, and I just thought you'd like to know. It's interesting just to reflect, what would it be like to receive feedback like that? If someone did actually sit down with you and say, how are you doing? How's your week going? Have a conversation if you need to. you remember when we were chatting yesterday morning about this, this and this? After we spoke, I felt a bit upset and, a little bit embarrassed. And I just thought you'd like to know. What would it be like to receive feedback like that? And the evidence would suggest that the vast majority of the time when people do receive feedback like that at some level they reflect. Because we're not saying, you did this, you should have done that, I'm going to do this, you're a bad person, you're a rude person, I'm a sensitive. We're not getting lost in any of that. And they might think that person's being too sensitive, but the point is, at some level, most people still do reflect. And therefore, behaviours do change. Those 37,000 events I mentioned, when feedback was reported in this way, after one conversation, it only went on to happen again 2,000 times. 37,000 down to 2,000. And when they had two conversations, it was reduced to 260. So 37,000 down to 260 just through letting people know how they feel after an event. So we're just trying to share the concept of these conversations, but we're also acknowledging that this is an ideal version, and it isn't always that easy. The recipient might not always want to do this, but they do, and that's great when they do, and that's what we're trying to have a language and an understanding of. But the thing is really important to bear in mind is that it might not be that simple. So yes, we might want to do it as a recipient, and the other thing that we haven't got time to talk about now is how this can be done as a witness. But the thing I would like to just spend a few minutes on is the concept of what we call second messengers. Second messenger is an element within that Vanderbilt University research I mentioned. They found that quite a lot of the time the recipients don't want to do that themselves. And what you have to do is create an alternative channel. You have to create an extra means by which they can pass on that feedback if they don't want to do it directly. And second messengers is a peer-to-peer system where you identify members within a team who other people feel safe speaking to, and you help them to deliver these messages on the behalf of others. So what we did is during the workshops we ran for Team Ralph back in, it was almost exactly 2 years ago now, in 2021, we just left a bit of paper on every chair during the workshops and said, leave a name of someone you would feel comfortable going and having this conversation with on your behalf. Anyone, just someone that comes to mind. We took the names in, anyone whose name who came up more than once, we contacted them and said, your name's come up as someone who people would feel comfortable talking to. Would you like to be a second messenger? And if they said yes, we kind of offered some additional workshops and discussions. And then we sort of try and keep those discussions going for those people, and we let everyone know these are your second messengers. And as part of the workshops we do with everyone knows why we have second messengers, what the system is, the evidence base around the process, because it was part of the research at the university, Vanderbilt University. But the point is, it's a peer-to-peer system, and it's not about telling on someone, it's not about reporting them, because it's the reason you have these sort of allocated second messengers is they're going to speak to people with their second messenger hat on. And so if someone goes to someone as a second messenger, they're doing exactly the same thing. They're just saying, finding a chance to chat, how are you doing? How's your week going? Whatever they want to do. Do you remember when this person came and spoke to you on this day about this thing? Usually they say yes. And, after you spoke, it sounds like they felt like this, whatever they felt. And I thought you'd like to know. And actually, the evidence shows that the response is broadly the same. That people actually, when they receive feedback in that way, when it's not being done in a judgmental or a critical or a consequence-based way, people do care. And so when you set up a system that's done, and so it's a channel so that you can deliver this feedback informally, you don't have to go to a line manager or a member of the H&R team. You don't have to just sit there in silence. You have some other way of doing it. It's a way of integrating this whole concept within the system so that people do have that option. So for me, it's a really, really important element of what we do. We do have a second messenger system which we kind of revisit in different ways in terms of the support for them, and also who's in that group, and obviously communicating with the wider team about how they can support and what they can do as well. So yeah, it's really just a chance to kind of give you an overview of what this is, this subject, because I think it's a valuable subject for everyone to have an awareness of. So it's something you can go away with and be aware of and look into if you find it valuable, but also to know how we're applying these concepts here at the Ralph. So some of the risks and challenges just in the last few minutes. Civility Saves Lives, weirdly, is not about being nice. I mean, it might be, but it's not as simple as just saying everyone be nice to each other. Go around with a big fake smile on your face. Whatever happens. That's quite toxic. That's not helpful. Psychological safety is often about being willing to have challenging conversations if we need to, feeling safe to be able to do that. If we have to raise a concern, if we don't agree with someone, feeling like we would be respected and heard. Calling out of compassion is not a weapon. We're not trying to use this to get a one-up on people. Dealing with pushbacks during these courageous conversations. You know, sometimes people can say, especially to a second messenger, I happen to be one of them just because my name did come up when we did the ballot. And when I've delivered these messages to people, sometimes they say, well, you know, you weren't there and you don't know why I responded that way because you don't know what they did to me before. And I'm like, and I can say, actually, yeah, I wasn't there. All I know is how they feel. And it's not about who's right and wrong or whether anyone was rude or not rude. All I ask is that you hear me. And that's it, because actually, that's all it's about. Calling out compassion does not replace accountability. We all have an accountability, either because if we do something as an individual event, knowing that if someone does harass someone on grounds of prejudice or physically assault someone, then we're not going to call out with compassion. That's different. And if someone is knowingly, if there's evidence after a process of feeding something back 3, 4, 5 times, and it's clear that someone knows that they're causing distress, and they're choosing not to do anything about it, and that's clear, then that becomes a different conversation too. It's very, very unlikely, and there's lots of evidence for that too. But we're not trying to sort of take this approach where there is no accountability, because accountability is a very positive word when it's used, I think, in the broader sense of this whole discussion. So that's kind of what I mean by this permissive environment. Those are the things we can do to help to prevent that permissive environment. And we're just using all the information that's available to us, the evidence that's available to us, to apply that to what we're doing here at the Ralph. And one of the things we've done is developed a social contract based upon feedback at different workshops we've run. I won't go into too much of it now, but you know, we've reviewed this as well, and we've got more feedback since. And it's just a reminder of some of the different elements of what we discussed at the workshops. A social contract is that, exactly that. It's a voluntary agreement for mutual benefit. It's not something that we're bound to, something that people sign, but it is something that everyone gets a chance to see. And if they disagree with, they can say, I disagree with that. And therefore we can look at modifying it. But there's an assumption that everyone's had a chance to see it, unless we get feedback suggesting that there's something that people don't agree with, that therefore it is something that we can use as a reference point within this discussion. So that is something that we've engaged everybody with at different times over the last few years. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview. As I said, it's a chance to just give you an example of something that we're doing, rather than just hoping that these values, by saying what they are and communicating those, realizing that it's not as simple as that. And there are so many different ways of doing it, but this is one of many ways of actually doing something. It doesn't solve everything. It doesn't just totally eradicate this challenge, but it is something that we can do, and it is something that we will continue to do. So hopefully it's been interesting learning about it, but also just an example of ways in which we live our core values here at the Ralph. So thank you very much. Happy to chat and take questions.